If you are clenching the vowels off of your keyboard because of rebuild errors in SolidWorks, whether it be a part, sketch, assembly, or drawing, let's go through errors, warnings, and any problems you have in rebuilding and over constraints, and talk about not only how to fix them, but what causes them in the first place, as then you will be able to prevent rebuild errors from occurring in the first place when you know what to look for. Here I have a fully defined sketch, and I have this line that is 10 inches long, and if I click on this relation, you can see that this line is equal to this line, so these both are 10 inches, and this line is equal to this line, so these are 10 inches. One of the, and I think error falls under several categories. A subset of an error is a warning. Warnings show up in yellow. And warnings tell us that SolidWorks was able to generate the feature that we wanted, but there is a problem with the references. Let's generate a warning. This line is being told to be 10 inches by an equal relation. If I add in another 10-inch dimension, and I choose to leave it driving, I have what's called a warning. And if I rebuild my sketch, I have, see, warning right there. Sketch is overdefined. Delete overdefining dimensions or relations. So if I go back into my sketch and handle this warning, all I really have to do is either delete this dimension or delete something else that makes it so that there's only one thing telling your sketch what to be. If I have two drivers, SolidWorks will always throw a warning. Well, maybe usually. Sometimes it will let a redundant constraint slide, but often, at least, it will throw a warning. Let's talk about another one. So if all of these lines are 10 inches, then this diagonal line has to be longer than 10 inches, right? So if I take these two lines and try to set them equal, that is something that is mathematically impossible. It is impossible to fulfill all of these constraints at once. When something is impossible, you get a red notification, and that is a true error. And I can even add more errors by re-adding my 10-inch dimensions. So if I have a very messy sketch full of errors and warnings, then it can be very hard to trace back what the actual problem is. So some options to help you with this overdefined sketch is to come down here where it says overdefined and open up what's called the sketch expert. I can do that simply by clicking. Here's my sketch expert, and I can press diagnose to find solutions to this sketch error. So SolidWorks will autonomously try combinations of deleting constraints and relations in order to try to find a solution. If I say diagnose, it will take a few moments to look for solutions to my sketch. And here I have 23 proposed solutions. The first one is deleting this equal length and deleting this dimension. SolidWorks puts the most obvious and relevant solutions first. Generally, your most effective solution will be your first few solutions. If I like that, I can choose to accept, or I can use this button to tab to the next one. And here it's having me very similarly delete this with the equal that I added. And I can scroll through and notice some of these will leave you with an underdefined sketch. Also, bear in mind that you will have modified geometry with some of your sketches. So make sure that you watch for fully defined constraints, and geometry that you like. I'll accept this first one. Notice I still have a warning here. If I rebuild, the warning goes away. So make sure that you're not getting hung up on warnings that don't exist. It just takes a rebuild to let the history tree know that there's no longer a warning. Let's go through some other sketching skills in this next example. Here I have a house. This is my crowning achievement, best model I've ever made. This house is made very simply. I made an extrusion, and then I did a little cut extrude, and then I did a boss extrude for the chimney, And then I did a cut extrude for the word house on my house, just in case it wasn't obvious. From this house, I've made a beautiful assembly. Look at that. Now it has a yard. And then I've added that into a drawing, and I've made some basic dimensions. Let's say I want to modify the geometry of my house. Well, this is where potential errors can come in. I edit my sketch. Let's say I make this construction geometry so I no longer have to reference off of it. And technically still reference off of construction geometry, but I'm not making my solid from that anymore. Let's make that equal. And kind of adding a nice little extension to the front room here. Maybe I can add in a little angle of 45. And I can add a little dimension here, maybe 1 inch. Small house, maybe for a mouse or something. So I've done a nice job, right? Because I'm fully constrained. So let's see how this updates. You'll notice every subsequent feature fails. Well, that's a problem. If I open up my assembly fails. You'll notice I have yellow warnings and red errors. So we have things that couldn't even be generated to begin with, and things that are warning me. I go to my drawing. My drawing has what we call hanging or dangling dimensions. I say dangling, the proper term is hanging. I guess you can call that some SolidWorks slang. What is going on here? All I did was replace a few lines. Well, let's go through what causes these errors to begin with. If I go back to my house here, I'm going to hit Control Z, edit, undo, 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 undo. There we go. So that's the sketch that I started with. Let's call this maybe, if this was the second line that I've ever made in this sketch, that's going to be called line 2. So if I extrude this sketch, and I have line 2 right here, maybe I have line 1 right here, and I extrude, why, this is face 2, right, because it was extruded from line 2, and this is face 1 because it was extruded from line 1, and so on and so forth. And so if I make subsequent features, like this sketch here, I've got a dimension that's 6 inches, and it's referencing off of line 2. And so if line 2 goes missing, this sketch says, hey, I was referencing off of line 2 and now it's gone. I don't know what to reference my sketches from anymore. I don't know what to reference the 6 inches from anymore. So that's where rebuild errors come from. It's missing its reference. So if I go in, I'm going to talk to you about how to prevent these errors from beginning in the first place, right? So you can make that update and it won't even trip an error. We'll go into that. But sometimes there are unpreventable rebuild errors that you come across. This happens especially in complex models. How do you deal with updating and fixing the errors in a sketch or in a part or in an assembly? So I'm going to produce my error again, right? We'll go for construction. I'm going to make my nice little bay feature here, and we'll add in our equal relation, and then we'll add in some geometry. We'll make that 90 degrees, and then make that 1 inch. Beautiful, right? So we've rebuilt everything, and we have errors. So if we go to our next sketch, there are a lot of errors in this sketch. You'll notice I have these yellow parts that are dangling or hanging. So it's saying that this vertical point was vertical to something, and whatever it was vertical to was gone. This 6 inches was referencing off of this line, and now the line is gone. So there's an error, and it's what's in a state of known as hanging or dangling. How do we fix this? Well, first off, it can be hard to find all of the relations that are hanging. If you're having problems with that, you can right-click on something in the sketch and go to Display Delete Relations. And you notice this line is selected, and it gives me all the relations for whatever entity I select. Now, I can filter this for every relation. and it shows me these yellow hanging relations. I can filter only for dangling, so it shows me only the dangling relations, or only the over-defining relations, which there aren't any in this sketch, or external relations, anything in a sketch that is referencing something from the assembly. And let's go to, or from another body or another feature on the part or something like that. Anything that's outside of the sketch. So let's go to all in the sketch, and that's how we can see what we're dealing with here. So the first thing, I can get rid of this hanging relation because that feature is not there anymore. And I can find another feature that replaces it. Maybe that back point we can set to vertical. Or I can choose this midpoint here. And notice I've got another midpoint error there. And make that vertical to that midpoint. That's fine. This red point at the end of the sketch shows that this reference of that point is broken. So I can grab that red point and I can make it coincident on my origin to replace the entity, and that's fixed. I can delete this coincident and replace the coincident. And you may come across a time when maybe you don't have something to be vertical and what you're missing is totally gone. You can always use center lines or other features. And maybe if I set these center lines to be equal, I'm referencing the middle of my house, and I can make that vertical instead, right? So you can use reference geometry to replace what you're missing. So it looks like we have no other hanging dimensions in this sketch, but don't fall into that trap. It's a good idea to always go with display delete relations and go into dangling, and you can see we have a hidden midpoint that we would have otherwise missed. And if I straight delete that, notice everything stays fully defined down here. So that's an example of one case in which you can have redundant constraints in a sketch. Avoid that when possible though. So let's exit that sketch. And you'll notice we still have an error, right? We just worked on the sketch and there's still an error but nothing wrong with the sketch. If you come across that, where there's an error with the sketch but there's no hanging relations, it could very possibly be that it can't find a face or plane. And if I highlight this sketch, it says, warning, could not find face or plane. So I'll right click and I say, edit sketch plane. And I'll make my sketch plane on this new face, and that replaces the old face that is no longer there. And you can see now there are no errors with what we've been working on. I can do the same thing coming from this sketch. You'll notice my 8-inch dimension is referencing that missing line. And so we simply replace that reference, and I can grab the red part and make it coincident. Oh, doesn't want to get coincident here. There we go, onto that edge. And there's no more error. So I exit the sketch, and notice these features are now clear. I go to my final sketch here, and if I make a section view, you can see I still have my text, but it's inside of my part. And so if I go to edit sketch plane and give it the new face, we've cleared all the errors. Now if I go to my assembly, you can see I've got some major problems here. Notice I've got mate errors, and these are true errors. If I edit my feature, notice I have a hanging face, right? It's missing the face altogether. And so I have the opportunity to just simply select this and replace the face. And it goes to the dimension that it was. And now, no more problems. Likewise. And this also happens with missing dimensions, right? So if I remove, say, if I reference this chimney here, and I do a distance like that, and then the chimney is gone, I get a same error of missing face. Let's go to the drawing. And I have bad dimensions. And it's because the line that these dimensions were all referencing off of are gone. So I have to re-add my dimensions. however I want to do it, and then delete the old ones. So you can see this is a very time-consuming process, and it would sure be nice if we could go back and just edit the sketch and have no errors whatsoever anywhere. Let's see if we can do that. Don't save, don't save, and don't save. Right? So I'm going to open up everything as it was, and we'll see if there's a way that we can do this. Alright, so here I've reopened my house, and it is as it was before. I look at my assembly, same thing. I open up my drawing, the exact same thing, right? So it's exactly how we started. Now let's edit this sketch. And as you've seen, there are so many dimensions that reference the position of this line. And if I get rid of this line, I'm in big trouble. Because so many dimensions reference off of it. So what I'll do is I'm going to sketch here, here, and here. And instead of deleting this line, or instead of making this line for construction, I'm going to highlight this line and choose Replace Entity, and choose my new line. And what I'm saying is all the references concerned with this line are now going to go to this line. And it gives me the option to either make this construction or to just delete this entirely. I'll leave it with Make Construction. And now, if I finish dimensioning my sketch, I'll make this, well, not 4 degrees, but rather 45 degrees. And yeah, I'll give this 1 inch, and we'll make these equal. We're fully defined. And now this line has been replaced by this line, right? So if I rebuild, there are no errors whatsoever, right? Because all the new dimensions are referencing this line instead of the last one. I open up my assembly. No errors, because we're now referencing this line and SolidWorks knows what to reference. We open up the drawing. All the lines remain the same, and we're referencing the brand new line that we drew. So everything is capiche because we did that. Now, as I said before, there are some situations where that will not work. Let me give you an example. Open up my house once more. And this time, I'm going to Control Z again. We're undoing everything, right? So I'm going to stop there. This time, I'm going to make an angled face. And we'll give this a smart dimension. And again, 1 inch. I'm going to do the same angle. Right, so we just have a different profile. And I'm going to choose Replace Entity. And we're going to replace it with this line. We've replaced the entity. And notice now I have a rebuild error, but I only have one. Everything else worked out. You'll notice my chimney isn't square anymore. So let's take a look at what's going on. The problems with my sketch. You'll notice this line has a horizontal constraint, and it's red. That means that SolidWorks couldn't even make it horizontal. It's not a warning, it's an error. And this line, this dimension rather, has superseded. It's made this parallel with this because that's what the dimension requires to be a valid dimension. So to escape this conflict, I'll get rid of this dimension. But as you can see, even with Replace Entity, sometimes you come across stuff that you just can't fix by yourself. I add a new dimension, and I exit the sketch, and everything else is fine. I come into my assembly, and we have, again, errors. We can't even generate what we want. So what's going on is I am coincident there, no problem. I have a width mate, and that's my problem. I have a warning on my width mate because I'm able to produce it, but I have an error here. I have a dimension, And notice this face is now sitting at an angle with this straight face, which it wasn't before. And you can't have a dimension on angled faces. What do you reference off of, right? So that dimension won't work. So this dimension is our problem. If I edit my feature and I establish dimension, maybe not to my face, but rather a dimension to maybe this point. And then I can, there you go, flip it to the other side. That leaves us in relatively the same place and no more errors. So there's always a few errors that you have to clear. Notice my dimensions that we're referencing off of my line are completely messed up now. So there's always going to be some unavoidable circumstances when a modification will produce an error. But replacing entities and understanding how SolidWorks references sketches to faces and faces to features and everything else can help you to know what to look for when repairing these rebuild errors. I hope this video was helpful. If it was, please subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.